Right, I'm looking at the knee, this knee specifically. I think the sort of area where the knee starts to bend is more or less on the quarter mark over here, so we can just kind of try to connect it, imagine it continuing that way. We get something a little bit better over there. Okay, usually you would like to start with the area that has the least development up until that stage, of course. So maybe for us, I don't know, it seems pretty even to me. So maybe since we sort of simplified this foot area a little bit at the start, we can now sort of start looking for some refinements over here. So there's the heel area sort of overlapping the mid part of the foot there. I'm just indicating that a little bit. Perhaps the heel area actually can continue a little bit further as well. We don't want the foot to look too thick. Speaking of thickness, maybe we can actually push this negative space a little bit to the left over there, and then we can really just push in this ankle a little bit as well. Sorry, not this ankle, this heel. And then we can look for this alignment, but it's still not really connecting too well. So maybe this angle is not correct. It needs to be more like this, so we can actually find the connection on this feet. This, you know, working from a photo comes with its downsides as well, which I guess could be that, you know, the picture is very exact with the model. You would sort of pick a pose because, you know, this knee, for example, it will move a lot around. You know, you might just see a sliver. Sometimes you might see something like this happening in here. Sometimes it might be almost fully behind it if she's slightly rotated more. Sometimes it might jut out more, you know. So there's a lot of moving factors with the live model. So now I'm sort of stuck with no choices to make. I just sort of have to try to nail it exactly, which is doable, but it's not easy. So I'm just trying to figure out this leg area here. Honestly, maybe it was actually closer to what I was seeing here initially. Maybe I pushed out the foot a little bit too much. I mean, pushed in, like behind this other leg. So now it's looking a little bit more natural. So these are the types of things we want to really figure out before we head too far into the drawing, so we don't find ourselves in big trouble later on. Okay, still think this area is looking a little bit thick, so maybe we just sort of extend the negative shape area a little bit. By negative shapes, by the way, I mean these sort of areas that are left between different things. Or we could look at a negative shape, you know, maybe this area over here that is being left sort of outside of the figure. We just put a straight line in here and we'll get some kind of shape over here. And then we could, you know, compare this shape to what we're seeing on the model. Maybe this model doesn't have the best examples to show you that, but one negative shape we could look at, for example, is this one over here. I can see the knees now more or less aligned with the edge of the pelvis there. Seems all right, but my toes should be a little bit further down. Sorry, not further down. Further in, maybe towards the plumb line. So yeah, perhaps that's more like it. This ankle area is just a little bit too exaggerated in its thickness, so let's just push that a little bit. There is a thickness to the ankle. And maybe this side we can just thin down the ankle a little bit. So this is a little bit on the precise side already, but I just want to, get something down that I can then later, look at more closely. If you lose the plumb line and it's an important area that you still have to work on a lot, maybe just get the ruler, put the plumb line in. If not, if you feel like you can still sort of see it happening there, don't worry about it. You're gonna erase it at one point anyway. That will be before the big 4 modeling for us. With the transfer, we of course don't put in the plumb line at that point anymore, so you can just get rid of it that way. But since I'm just carrying on with this stage, then I'll just stick with the plumb line for now and get rid of it later. Okay, so I think at this point, until this point, I've sort of worked with a intentionally slightly duller pencil, since I kind of wanted these soft searching marks. So now I'll just sharpen my pencil as we start looking for more accurate information. I guess there would be something simple to find here in the face. Just find the underplane of the nose. And perhaps the chin is just coming out a little bit. And wow, she looks like a human being already. That's great. I would say that aligns with our goals on this project. So let's just sort of refine this shoulder area a little bit. Can't help it, I just have to nudge things around. So I'm just sort of looking at the reference and sort of depicting the slighter changes in anatomy. This bump here is the acromion process we're seeing, basically. I think at least that's what we're seeing. And the deltoid sort of starts going from there. We don't want to give her shoulders too much width. That sort of doesn't really fit. I mean, obviously some females do have very wide shoulders, but in general it's more of an even balance between the waist and the shoulders, whereas you want to sort of illustrate someone as very masculine, then you would flatter them by making the shoulders very wide. So if you want to sort of emphasize the feminine side of things, maybe on a female model like this, then you don't really want to push the shoulders out too wide. Of course, we want to represent our subject pretty accurately, not idealize too much in any ways, as this is sort of a naturalistic exercise, I would say. So in this case, we're working with the gesture. We're still working in sort of straight line construction. We're putting in the small contours of the arm here, but we're still kind of trying to work in the general C curve, just nudging things a little bit inside, outside to create this form that we're seeing. So I'm working a little bit here and a little bit there. Feel like this arm over here just kind of comes in a little bit more than what I put it. It's a little bit thinner as well. we can just nudge it inward a little bit. Actually, the kneaded eraser is a lot better for this stage. Also, it doesn't stain the paper as easily as that hard eraser. So maybe now we wonder, where should we place the elbow? We can see a sort of alignment over here for the elbows. Her whole torso is a little bit tilted like this. Sort of makes sense then for her left elbow to be a little bit lower as well. So we keep this sort of overarching ideas in mind as well while we're working. It's always, when you're placing a detail, it's good to look at the big picture. That's maybe what I'm saying. That'll help you out. There is a lot of asymmetry in humans, but of course that's a lot less subtle. Doesn't really apply for these anatomical landmarks that much. It's especially noticeable in the human face. Also, when you make a lot of these adjustments as a student, you should be sort of measuring all the time. You know, you should check things like how wide is this compared to a quarter, for example. Just do it for the heck of it here. Maybe I'll find out I'm way off, but so I get something like this maybe on my measurement here. It's not too far off. Maybe the hand is just a little bit more out. I'm kind of happy with the proportions as well. I want to check my top quarter placement actually, is it? So yeah, maybe it is actually somewhere along there. You know, since I see the bottom of the scapula happening somewhere in here, maybe it's not too far off. I was just thinking maybe it should be a bit lower, but yeah, maybe there's something a little bit funky about it. Maybe I should change the shoulders slightly higher, but honestly, I don't see a lot of need for that. Perhaps the head is a little bit on the large side. Let's just change that. At least this chin is a little bit maybe too far down. Maybe with this we could just slightly nudge these shoulders a little bit higher as well. Just to sort of maintain the relationship of these shoulders, we just want to sort of have that little tilt, this kind of tilt on the shoulders, and then lift it a little bit. And maybe now with this change, the quarter sort of aligns a little bit better with this sort of bottom of the scapula, which I was wondering about. So with some very small changes you can get, you know, good results in accuracy, but honestly this is not an accuracy demonstration, it's more about the general stuff in figure drawing. So with comparative measurement, especially you want to really look for alignments. As I said, maybe something like this, you know, with the elbows aligning with each other in this diagonal. Maybe you want to look for the alignment between these creases over here. You want to look for vertical alignments. You know, if I drop a line from this right edge of the figure, is it actually hitting the heel? It shouldn't be. It's not. That's good. Same with the hand. That is the leftmost point. Is it hitting anything else? No. Good. How are the negative shapes looking? You know, is this sort of shape over here, is it looking right? It's looking in the ballpark at least. Is this shape correct? Maybe we could have a little bit more lean, that would be more gestureful. Perhaps something like that we could change. I don't really feel the need. This pose has, I feel, the sort of flowing gesture already. To my taste at least. Gesture also is a little bit of a taste thing, and I'm not really a, you know, expert in figure stuff, but I can do it to some level, you know. Also, when we were nudging this arm around here, we lost some information over here. Let's put it back. Okay. Okay, so let's continue refining things. This here I see as a pretty much a straight line. From there we can get a little bit of roundness in this area, of course. And perhaps push this a little bit. Also, it's pretty straight, but we can push the roundness a little bit on there. There's a little shift over here as well before it sort of heads into the thigh. So now we get that little bit of curve going on there as well. And I think this crease placement is all right, but we just want to maybe make the thigh a little bit less thick over here. This side sort of falls into shadow, so it's a bit tricky to grasp the width because there's a whole lot of here that falls into shadow. So it can be a bit tricky to sort of gauge the thickness of this light shape versus the shadow shape. It might be that actually this will be a little bit thicker, that's my guess. Just looks a bit weird maybe at this stage because we don't have the shadow there. Also, we don't have a background, so. But that maybe looks a bit more in proportion, sort of tapers down to the knee area. Angle of the foot is a little bit tricky. It's hard to see what's happening over here. Don't really maybe have to put in a lot of that stuff over there, but it does sort of curve in a little bit. It's the sort of the fan shape of the toes does that. This area we already looked at, but let's just sort of refine some things. There's actually this little knob of the lateral malleole sort of popping out of there as well. Kind of changing the outline of the, or let's say outer contour of this leg over here. That wasn't a great line, let's get rid of it. So yeah, I think this is pretty good for the construct of the outline. So next up we should probably look for shadow shapes. And we look for shadow shapes, of course, in places where there's, you know, a distinct division between dark and light. So with this figure pose, it's a little bit tricky maybe because there's so much light versus shadow. It's almost like almost front lit. It's a little bit maybe from behind or right, the lighting on this pose. So we only see mainly these shadows at the very edges, but we'll just put in those as we see them. So maybe we don't really have to start in any specific place, just maybe start with whatever feels the most obvious to you. And again, we're just doing straight lines here. Here I'm pondering if I should actually include this shadow on the Achilles tendon in the shadow shapes, and the answer is no. I don't want to, because it's, you know, smack in the middle of the light area. I don't want to put a shadow in there, so we'll just treat it as a halftone. Did something similar on the Barg project, if you recall, where I sort of ignored some shadows in the earlier stages and just put them in later as halftone shapes. In that case, we could have done sort of either way. Here there's the lateral malleoles again, and we can just sort of imagine something. We can see on the feet of this model there's some veins happening. We'll maybe prefer to ignore those for the time being, at least. Maybe you can put in 1 or 2 of those, but we don't really want to, you know, put too much attention on those. One, it's not very flattering, and as you know, another thing, of course, those are, you know, very minute details. We're honestly studying the figure for the main, you know, forms and anatomy, not to put in some random veins that are on the surface that basically differ from person to person. Those can be, you know, put in. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I won't be putting in stuff like that because it's just a little bit unnecessary. Also, if there's a lot of like super fine details like rendered veins in this area, maybe it's not the best because the rest of the image is pretty clean in the lights. It's just subtle things. So, you know, we have this sort of focal area over here we would like the viewer to look at, and then suddenly we have a very, you know, busy area in the feet where maybe it's not, you know, we tend not to create the focal point in the feet area. I mean, maybe you will, but I don't really recommend that. At least it's not very orthodox, let's say. There's nothing wrong with that again, though, but, you know, just saying you might want to be careful with that if you decide to put in a lot of detail like that. I'm guessing here's where a little bit of, you know, anatomical knowledge comes in. There's a little bit of information that sort of can get obscured by these smaller details on this image. Like those veins, for example, like they can obscure a little bit how the forms are taking shape. Yeah, then there's the shadow underneath the foot. Actually, this looked pretty weird until now. Now we finally get to put in the shadow that sort of describes the overlap over here as well. Well, I'm not saying it looked maybe weird, but it sort of looked a little bit harder to. So less clear, let's say. I'm not saying these shadow shape lines make it any clearer yet, but once we put in the tone, maybe it starts looking more like a foot rather than just a weird jumble of lines. Okay, so at this stage, construction stage, that being, we're not gonna put in any information for the fingers really. We don't really need to yet. That will be the next stage. We can refine the outline a little bit. You know, we don't have to just have this blocky shape, but so we can just sort of prep ourselves a little bit for the next stage. Yeah, so we have a place to put the fingers in then. Also, this paint is a little bit wet, so I keep getting it on my hand a little bit, which is a bit annoying. I'm assuming it's not a problem you will be facing, but for me, I was just painting on this larger painting here yesterday, which means all these mounting points are still kind of wet with paint, and now that it's already stained my paper, I'm just too lazy to clean it up any more than I already have. And even when we see these anatomical details, like over here, there's a bit of the wrist bone sort of bumping out of there, let's say. we don't really want to overplay it too much. Might look a little bit weird. So now that we we should be moving stage by stage, but we for sort of ignored the hand a little bit over there. It's actually just to simplify this hand, let's just look for this sort of shadow shape all the way over here. Actually, there's just barely a sliver of a shadow on this forearm area. It's just basically, I guess we could call it a rim shadow or a thick dark outline. At this point, there's just so little of it. Okay, let's put it in there. And then there's a little bit of shadow on here on the neck. So no real shadows on this side. The entire face is in the shadow. Maybe finally we just have a cast shadow left on the figure by the hair over here. So let's just put that in. Honestly, this is a little bit unnecessary at this point because we're gonna lose this shadow to hair in light distinction pretty soon anyways, but you'll see why, but we still want to put it in at this point. We can create sort of a little memory for ourselves, something like this happened, and perhaps we'll remember to put these lines in the same place later on. We're not really afraid to lose some things when we tone things in. That just creates us an opportunity to get some really nice lost edges and all that kind of stuff. So there's a little sliver of light over here on the hair in the front. Also gives us a little bit of an idea of the three-dimensional form over here. Just turns to shadow before the edge. Great. So we can start hinting at her hairstyle a little bit. This is pretty nice actually. It sort of gives us the impression instantly that she has bangs, and there's sort of, a little bit more three-dimensional, coming out a little bit from here and catching a little bit of light as opposed to this side of the head. So next up, let's put something like a shadow edge over here. The head is effectively just a sphere. Let's treat it that way. Actually, I have to zoom in a little bit over here to just see where the shadow edge goes. It's just so dark that it's hard to see, especially from a screen and a little bit further away. I think it's actually the edge is a little bit further. Let's make it a little bit more round and sphere-like. This transition is gonna move regardless, but this is just a sort of decision where we separate this for now. Let me just check the face again. Is that actually entirely in shadow or not? It isn't actually. Yeah, so there's a little bit of light on her face as well. That's actually all right. Squinting down, it's very dark overall, but we can just put a little bit of a light shape over here. It sort of falls into shadow pretty quickly. So it's gonna look actually pretty wrong to put this in as a light shape, because then we're gonna just tone everything around. I think it's best we actually leave this as a shadow shape. Since squinting down, we actually see this as one sort of darker shape. Maybe the outlines are a little bit darker, but we can also address this area as a shadow. It's just a sort of grouping kind of thing, I guess, at this point. But you know, because when we tone in the darks, we'll be left with a stark white area over here, which isn't really all that nice to look at that point. So, and it's very close to being a shadow, so we might as well just, you know, treat it as a shadow, and then, you know, ever so slightly bring it up a little bit afterwards to create a little bit of that form. So I think that's, you know, process-wise, it's going to be a little bit easier. Okay, just going over one final time over here. Well, we can just sort of, these are shadow shapes, these creases, so let's just reinforce those maybe a little bit, just make ourselves sure of the placement. This part really isn't a shadow. But we want to keep it there because it's pretty informative. Also, this crease is just a sliver of a shadow at the bottom over there, but yeah. This part has a little bit of a thicker shadow, but it's maybe not even as thick as this. But yeah, we won't go further than that with this stage. Now just go over everything, see if you actually need to do any changes. Well, I see myself, I see I've left myself pretty much like 2 parallel lines over here all along the way. Now I sort of need to decide which one is the real one. Oh, I think I'm going rather thinner than thicker with the arm over here. It's probably the more likely one to be accurate. So again, with the sort of pushing in the arm, then we can also push in the shape a little bit. All right. Just take a final look before calling it a stage, I think. So this was construct of the outline and construct of the shadow shapes. And next up will be the articulation of the outline as well as the shadow shapes. Articulation also meaning these finer details and nuances of maybe the portrait and the hand, for example, as well as the toes, if we had any. Visible, we don't really have any properly visible toes. We can of course zoom in and really put those in if we want to, but I don't think it's necessary even at this stage, maybe at the very rendering stage at the end. So all right,